Okay, everybody, I just wanted to give you a quick answer key to filling out the radians, and I couldn't find one online that I liked very much. So I'm going to start off with highlighting these red. These have a special name that I actually really like. I don't think very many people use the name, but I think it's fantastic. These are called the quadrantal angles because they land on the quadrants, the lines in between the quadrants. So the quadrantal angles kind of split the entire circle into fourths, which means that they split each pi into half. So if this is 0, then way over here is pi on the left side. So half of that would be pi over 2. So I have 0, pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, 4 pi over 2. So let me label that. We had 3 pi over 2 down here at the bottom because it was half of a pi, a whole pi, a pi and a half, and 2 pi's. Okay, so again, it's kind of easy to see. You can see, I'll do it with red here. This is pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, 4 pi over 2. And of course, 2 pi over 2 is the same thing as pi. And 4 pi over 2 is the same thing as 2 pi. So those are all the pi over 2 slices. And then I'm going to go into the quarters. So still starting here at 0 again. And then sorry, this is not that neat, but I think you'll get the idea. Okay, so notice that this little bit right here is 4 pi, sorry, 1/4 of pi. So there it goes. So this is pi over 4. And then the next blue line is 2 pi over 4, but of course 2 pi over 4 is the same thing as pi over 2. And then I have 3 pi over 4. And then I have 4 pi over 4, which of course again is the same thing as pi. 5 pi over 4. 6 pi over 4, which is the same thing as 3 pi over 2. And 7 pi over 4. And then, of course, we end at 8 pi over 4, which is the same thing as 2 pi. Okay, so what we have left are these tiny ones, and I'm going to highlight them and we can figure out what fraction they are. If you had any trouble with this, I would imagine that this one was challenging. So if I start here, I'm just going to highlight them first, the lines that are left. Okay, I'm highlighting the lines that are left. And I can kind of tell that I need to include the quadrantal angles. Okay, let's look at these green pieces and see if we can figure out how much of a fraction they are. I'm noticing this look to be about the same size. So notice that if you look at those green pieces, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 6 of them in pi. So that means one of them is going to be pi over 6. So I have pi over 6, and then I have 2 pi over 6. I'll reduce those in a minute. 3 pi over 6, and I started down by the right side of the x-axis, and I'm going up on the green lines. So pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6, 4 pi over 6, 5 pi over 6, and 6 pi over 6, which of course is pi. And then I should keep going. So that means that this green line will be 7 pi over 6. This green line will be 8 pi over 6. Then this quadrantal angle is 9 pi over 6, which of course is the same thing as 3 pi over 2. That means this one must be 10 pi over 6. And this one must be 11 pi over 6. And then we end with 12 pi over 6, which is 2 pi. Excuse me, you might notice that some of these can be reduced. So, I want to take a look. 2 pi over 6 is the same thing as pi over 3. 4 pi over 6 is the same thing as 2 pi over 3. So notice there's actually another way to divide this up. I could have like put a line here and a line here, and here, and here, and I would have had thirds. 1, 2, 3. Okay, and I'm getting a lot of lines on here. Hopefully that's not getting confusing, but right now I'm really just trying to simplify the fractions I have. So if I look at the green lines, 6 pi over 6 is obviously still pi. 7 pi over 6 can't be reduced. 8 pi over 6 is the same thing as 4 pi over 3, so there's another third. And 10 pi over 6, which I just circled, is the same thing as 5 pi over 3. So there's the other third. And there you have it. Notice there are some patterns. So I want you to start thinking about this because in pre-calculus, you're going to have to memorize all of these. Right now, I mostly just want you to understand where they're coming from, but you're eventually going to need to memorize these, and so I think noticing some patterns is going to help. So I would love it if you would write in the discussion board about what patterns you notice.